Hello, everybody. Welcome to IST 140. I'm, of course, Professor S, and this is today's lecture. Here is most all of the stuff that you need for exception handling. So first of all, what is an exception? Exception specifically is an object. It's an issue that needs to be handled. Oftentimes, we've been exposed to these from errors that we've made in our code. And so one way to kind of potentially look at this is like, how do you handle errors? Whether there are things that you can control or things that you can't. Java gives us a few mechanisms for doing that. So far what we've done is adjusted our code to make sure it doesn't, things don't happen. But when we start to get into things that we can't control, like files not being available when we're trying to open them, it's going to be kind of hard. So Java starts looking for us to handle them, and through that mechanism, we can control things that Java doesn't look for. So anyways, without being too much more vague about it, let's kind of get a little bit more into it. So exception handling comes in two parts, where it's detecting and handling. So detecting is where you're identifying an issue, and handling is where you're dealing with the issue. And really the idea is like these aren't usually in the same location. Oftentimes they could be in two separate locations. So you have a method that detects that there is an issue, and then when it's used, that's when it's handled. And so we'll talk about both of those as we go along. So anyways, here I have a simple method, divide nums, where we take two nums and we let's say that for num2, it's 0, right? And so notice that for double quote is equal to num1 divided by num2. Notice if that divides by 0, that's undefined, so it's going to have a problem. The program ends. So then what happens is like we get a method that says, I don't know, maybe that's because I have the arithmetic exception, but without that if statement, the code says the quotient is infinity, which is not correct. It's undefined. But with this as it stands, notice that it says arithmetic exception, and it says, what are you doing? You can't divide by 0. Because if you notice here, I say throw new arithmetic exception. What are you doing? You can't divide by 0. So it's identifying that num is equal to 0. And so what happens is if that's true, it throws this exception and the method ends. And so these two things don't come into pass. And so that's when the program crashes, and then it throws this thing saying what exception was thrown and a message that was tied to it. So the thing is like we can manually throw issues, and throwing meaning that we're pointing out, hey, here's an exception that can be handled later. So this isn't handled, this is just detecting. The syntax for throw is that you have to do throw, new, and then whatever the exception subclass is, and then depending upon if you want a message in it or not. It doesn't always warrant it. I mean, like if you're dividing, then probably and you have arithmetic exception, it's probably because you're dividing by 0. So, but let's say you want to be specific, and sometimes it's good to be specific, especially if you're doing the exception class itself. That could be anything. You need to be specific about what's going on. So in that case, you might want a message. So what are we talking about, these different subclasses? So with the exception class, here's the exception class, and notice there's a bunch of different subclasses for it. And they come in two different flavors. We have the checked exceptions and the unchecked exceptions. So the checked exceptions, these are things that the compiler checks to see if they're handled correctly, if there is a handling of them. Like the basic rule of thumb is that you can't help these. So like notice the file not found exception. That's something on there. Or malformed URL. Like say you make a link to something and that URL doesn't exist anymore or something like that. That's not something that you can control in your program. That's kind of what we're talking about here. But if that error exists, something has to happen. And so that's why it's looking for making sure you have a backup plan for if if it identifies it. The unchecked exceptions are things that the compiler doesn't check to see if they are handled correctly. And the rule of thumb is like these are things, issues you can help. And so you will get a crash oftentimes by these and say, hey, there's an issue with this. So Java already kind of throws exceptions in its own way, but it just involves in crashing the program. And one of the big things about handling these things is preventing the program from crashing. And you could use any one of these. And the book actually shows more, but like an example of one is like the illegal let's do the index out of bounds exception. So let's say you're going through every single element of an array in a normal for loop, and you're going from 0 to 6, right? So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are the different iterations that you hit, right? And let's say that there's only 5 elements in the array. So notice that you are going 1 over the amount of elements in the array. So it's looking at an element that doesn't exist, because it's out of bounds of the array. And so then what would happen is you have a message that would be an error that would be thrown that says index out of bounds exception or something like that. Okay. And so there are different things that we can kind of do to help control that. Here's some ways that we can handle this. So first of all, fix your code. And that's for runtime exceptions. That's like what we just talked about, or what we've done so far, where if you have issues, you just fix your code. Another thing is like if you put throws in the heading, so not throw, but throws in the heading title of the method, or the heading of the method. There we go. It's pretty much saying an IOU for the compiler that like when this method is like, we're not going to deal with it in this method specifically. We're just identifying that it could happen here. And so then you need to catch it in a try catch block. And so the try catch block, that's first time we've seen it, it's off to the right here. And so notice when we run this, and so this is using the method that we talked about before with the divide nums. Notice that when you enter 1.1 and 2.0, you get the quotient is 0.55. Okay. And then if you enter 1.1 and 0.0, you get, what are you doing? You can't divide by 0. So remember, that's the message that I put into the program, and notice that it's getting that message. And so what we're doing is this is essentially it's kind of like a little mini method, I guess. The idea is like we have a object. This is our object, a arithmetic object that's a parameter, and then we can do stuff with that parameter object in this small code. And so this isn't going to be like a bunch of lines. This is going to be like 1 or 2 lines, for us at least. So here's an example of where we're both throwing and catching an exception. So notice here in this code, we have system out print, enter a word that is not funky, and then the user enters in a word, and then it tests if that's funky. So let's say that they enter in a word that's not funky, then it skips this, and the program ends without crashing. And so let's say what happens is it says enter a word that's not funky, and they enter in funky. Then it says if user response equals funky, throw new exception. You were told not to enter funky. So this is a message that will be sent in here, and notice we'll later throw it. So what happens is it ends the set of the lines of code that we're on and goes straight to the catch where it looks for that exception. So notice exception. E is our object, and it says print out whatever the message is that is tied to it, which is in this case, you were told not to type in funky. So then what happens is the user says funky, it equals funky, and then it skips here and says you were told not to enter funky. Okay. Now what I want to do is show you an example of like so far, like how this can be helpful with what we know so far, right? So the idea is like so far the way that we handle code is by where we like fix it, like we add more loops or things like that. And the problem is like with sometimes when you just keep adding loops, it gets really confusing, right? Think about what you've learned about loops. Loops can get real confusing real fast. That's like pretty universal. Now, granted, we've been using some pretty simple loops, but the idea is it's like when you start trying to worry about different things, it gets crazy. So like, for instance, let's say that we want to have the user enter a number 1 through 10. Okay. There's also many different ways that the user could be a jerk, essentially, right? I've said assume that the user will follow directions. And so let's say that we want to make sure we could prevent the user from being a jerk. So we work in those weird situations. And so that's kind of what we're going to be doing in this example. So, and like we can use loops and things like that to do it, but it makes it way complex. And I'll try to show you how simple it can be when we're doing the handling of the exceptions here. So notice I have my main method here. So we're going to have a number stored to user number, and then we're going to print the results in this method here. So for the get num, it gets a number and it creates a scanner object and reads from the scanner or from the system, the command line. Sorry, I can't talk. And it says enter a number 1 through 10. And so it will read a int and then it will return that int. And that's what goes to the print that the number you entered was blank, right? So if we think about like the different things that can go wrong is what if they don't enter an int, right? So like at the left, it says enter a number 1 through 10, and I enter 1.2. What happens? Well, it crashes and says exception in thread main Java util input mismatch exception. So what I did here was in my method, my get num thing is that I throws input mismatch exception. Right? That's the change that I made in this method right here. And I did a try catch block for the two things. So this is what was originally in the main method, these two things. And then I put them in the try part of the try catch block. And then in the catch, like the input mismatch exception, because I'm going to throw it, it's something that is in this method here, or potentially thrown. And so then it will say you did not enter an integer 1 through 10. So then now when I enter a number 1 through 10, look what happens. So you did not enter an integer 1 through 10, which you did not. And then I run it again and I say enter a number 1 through 10 and I enter 12. And it says the number you entered was 12. Hard thing is like, so it's an integer, right? But it's not in that range of 1 through 10. Which is an issue because we wanted it to be 1 through 10 for whatever the reason. Now, also keep in mind this is going to be leaving, but this method stays the same, the print results, which is printing our number. All right, anyways, so here what I did was I modified the get num method. So it's still input mismatch exception, but notice that I have this if statement that I added in here where it says throw new illegal argument exception. So throw, not throws, throw. So here's throws, here's throw, new illegal argument exception, parentheses, right? And so notice that if it's less than 1 or greater than 10. And also, yeah, okay. And then so then if it is that, then it will throw that exception. So it will cut out of it. So let's say that the user enters in, well, okay, so 1.2. So it goes in here, it says, all right, enter a number, they enter 1.2, and it throws an input mismatch, and then it will just skip to, you did not enter an integer. I changed this message and to an integer 1 to 10, so now it's just plain you didn't enter an integer because it could be a letter, or it could be a word, or it could be some words, but if it's not an int, that's a problem, right? So let's kind of review again one more time. So we get to the point where user num, get num, so it goes in here, it reads from the command line, enter a number 1 through 10, an int, somebody puts a 1.2, and so before it goes on any further here, it just skips to this catch part and it will say, you did not enter an integer. And then the next thing is that, let's say we run it again and we're going to enter in 12. So we go through the same part, enter an int, still nothing thrown, and then it looks for, is the user number less than 1 or greater than 10? well, 12 is greater than 10, so this is true, and so it's going to throw illegal argument exception. And so it's going to skip this part right here and go straight to the legal argument exception. So it's going to go straight to here, not a number 1 through 10. And so that's what's going to print. And so notice the program's not crashing, it's just ending with that message. Finally, what we'll do is we enter a number 1 through 10. So we want to make sure that it works when it's good. And so what happens is we go into get num. We read the command line. We read a 1. This is not true because it's not less than 1 or greater than 10. So this isn't thrown. And so then it's going to put this value into user num right here, right? Because it's return value here, and it goes to print results, and it's going to print that number. That's right. And so then it will just say the number you entered was 3. Now, this is all great and all, but let's say that I want to keep prompting the user for a value until they enter in 10 or 1 through 10, excuse me, right? And so here's what I did was I modified my main method so that I had a loop. So first of all, I created, I declared and initiated the user num outside of the try block and had it equal to 0. And so while it's equal to 0, it's going to continue on to this loop. Now, the reason why this works so well, and it will work, is because the when this throws one or two of the errors, it skips down to the catch blocks. So it never actually stores anything in this user num. So if you enter in 1.2, user num never becomes 1.2 because it skips down to the input mismatch exception, right? Or if I enter in 12, it's going to do that. And so what happens is it finishes this code, it keeps trying again and again and again and again until it gets that integer, until it's no longer catching, until user number is no longer 0, okay? And it changes when it's a value that it likes, where it's an int and in that range. So notice these are things that we could have done. Like maybe think about like how would you have done this without the try catch blocks? And the thing is that it would have been a whole lot more lines of code. So I mean it's kind of a weird process at first, but really the thing is like this is going to make things a lot easier once you get the hang of it. So another thing that we need to talk about is like objects and classes. So we've been talking about classes and we've been talking about objects, but we haven't really talked about them for a bit. So specifically a class, we create objects are special instances of classes. And to create them, it's this basic format where we have a class and an object. Notice the object is lowercase and the class is uppercase, right? Class. And then also there's arguments sometimes there's no arguments, but that depends upon the class. And we also have to have a new beforehand. So here's some ones that we've worked on before. So scanner, notice that this is the argument here is system.in. So that's going to read from the command line. And so notice we have this class and the class, and this is our object, right? And then we can also scan strings, which we've done so far. So notice we have an object here, the scanner class, and then this is the argument is a string. Now with string, we've talked about is a class before. And so notice that we could assign the values here. This is a special class that allows us to do this, but really we could also do it the hard way of doing new string. So class, and then the argument would be the value that we wanted to be assigned to it. And so we could put a string in there and so have two strings with the same values. But one of the things that we couldn't put in there was system.in because that doesn't make sense for a string class, right? Because reading the command line, it's not how that works. So anyways, objects are technically in Java are things that store data and have methods applied from the class. So the classes kind of define what kind of methods that are going on and kind of manage the data that are in it. So here, like for an example, the basic structure, we have the object and then the method that's attached to it with any arguments if necessary. So like remember for the scanner, so remember these are our This is an example of objects, and then this is our method. Next line. So it will read everything on that line. Notice there's no arguments in here. Has next int returns a Boolean value. Right? If the person enters a int, it's true. If they don't, then it's false. Or if they enter something that's not an int, then it's false. For words.length, so notice words is a string, length is a method that's tied to it, so it will find the length of that string. It doesn't find the length of all strings, it finds the length of the object that it's attached to, words, right? And an example of an argument is char at, so it finds the character at whatever that index value is for this string here, right? So those are all old things that we've come to know, but there's some new classes that we're going to be building upon this basic structure. So file is and print writer are what we'll be looking at. So files, take files such as text files and turns it into something the scanner can use. So what we'll be doing is we'll be creating these file objects and creating scanner objects from them. Okay. Notice that the file is in quotes. Print writer, this is, we put the file also in quotes here. The thing is, it's like when we're using the scanner method, make sure you anticipate the file not found exception, so you're like handling it somewhere. The compiler will be looking for you to handle it. Also, for both of these, you're going to need to use the close method. Technically, you're supposed to use the close method for scanner, but with the strings and the command line, you haven't really needed to, so we haven't done it. But the idea is like at the end, you want to do that object.close to say that you're done using the scanner. Now, there is something else to kind of help with that process, and that's the finally block, where you do try finally. And so the idea is like you want finally for when you want to do something at the end. And it's usually used for cleaning up stuff, like using the close method for whatever objects that you have that need the close method, like print writer. So print writer, notice, is out, and then we have the file type. And so the idea is like you have, in this case, have something that uses print writer in here, and then finally. And so what happens is like no matter where this code terminates in these lines, when it leaves these lines of code, it will make sure it closes the scanner. Okay. So here's an example of one where we have out file is outdata.txt, print writer out, new print writer out file. And so notice that when it's done with printing these things, then it will close, okay, because it's in that finally block. One of the last things that we'll talk about is import. So all these things that we've talked about, you need to import them. Even the exception that I threw before, I had to import that. But just pay attention to like what it was. That was a java.util, I believe. These are java.ios. So it's not java.util, it's java.io. Anyways, I think that's good for today. Hopefully you found this helpful, and I'll see you all later. Bye. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please press the like button below. It lets me know I'm doing something right. If you have any questions about any of the content, please send a message to both me and the rest of the teaching team in Canvas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Don't send it through normal email. You will not get as fast response. If you have any suggestions for how I can make these videos better, please leave in the comments below. Don't forget to roundhouse kick the subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified for the next video. Anyways, I think that's good for now. See y'all later. Bye.